The Entheogens Theory, Reality Check, a video by Brian Hales made available April of 2024. In 2019, four authors wrote an article titled The Entheogenic Origins of Mormonism, a Working Hypothesis, which was published in the online Journal of Psychedelic Studies. It states, historical documents relating to early Mormonism suggest that Joseph Smith employed entheogen-infused sacraments to fulfill his promise that every Mormon convert would experience visions of God and spiritual ecstasies. This hypothesis alleges that Joseph Smith and his followers ingested chemical substances which, through pharmacological means, created hallucinations and other psychotropic effects that the Latter-day Saints interpreted as God-inspired visionary experiences, unaware that they were actually just drugged at the time. This video tests this theory by examining the details of the visionary accounts and comparing them to the known effects of the entheogenic drugs that reportedly caused them, to see if historical and scientific details support or contradict the hypothesis. If we first examine the specific historical descriptions of the early Latter-day Saint spiritual experiences, we recognize that the Joseph Smith Papers Project and multiple other articles and books have reprinted the accounts of early converts who reported their visionary experiences. Reviewing these accounts identifies specific characteristics of these spiritual encounters. Visions had a distinct beginning and ending. They did not commence gradually nor diminish gradually over similar periods. They experienced full, immediate recall after the event, no accounts of amnesia. Participants interpreted their experiences as divine in nature, and they increased their faith in Joseph Smith's specific teachings about the restoration. Speaking in tongues produced sounds interpreted as a genuine foreign language rather than babblings or just slurred speech. Prophesying was coherent and pertinent to their situations rather than random, arbitrary, or disconnected speech. There were numerous reports of conversations with spiritual beings who delivered meaningful, sometimes complex, messages. Many participants reported light and brightness, and multiple group experiences are described where several individuals reported the same vision. Additional qualities included the absence of grotesque or outlandish distortions of people or objects, no reports of intense sadness, persistent anxiety, fear of losing self, or desires to harm self or others. There are no accounts of visionary experiences increasing in intensity to the point of death. There are a few reports of physical weakness afterward, but no accounts of hours-long intoxication with incoherence or general unresponsiveness. There are no reports of nausea or altered bodily functions, no themes of darkness or obscurity. None are ever attributed to surreptitiously administered substances, and no cause-effect sequences are connected to previous sacrament administration. If we now transition to examining the specific drug effects and the logistics associated with the entheogens discussed in the article, we discover the authors describe 7 entheogens or chemical substances as capable of fooling religionists into thinking they are having spiritual visions. The first, Claviceps purpurea, is a plant that produces ergot, which is a substance made up of multiple chemicals. Limited exposure to ergot usually produces no psychotropic effects. However, prolonged consumption causes syndromes, including convulsive ergotism, characterized by paranoia and hallucinations, twitches, and spasms, and gangrenous ergotism, which causes loss of peripheral sensation, edema, and finally, the loss of affected tissues. Initially, the patient complains of general lassitude accompanied by pains in one of the limbs, usually the calf of the leg. Over the course of several weeks, the foot or sometimes the hand becomes swollen and inflamed. Then, characteristically, violent burning pains shoot through the affected limbs. Fingers, toes, even arms and feet may die and fall off due to vasoconstriction-induced hypoperfusion. Long-term consumption of clavicets causes ergot poisoning with hallucinations and multiple other chronic medical problems. For several reasons, descriptions of the ergot-induced hallucinations bear little resemblance to early Latter-day Saint visionary accounts. The second entheogen is Datura stramonium from the Jimson weed plant. In 2019, 293 individuals were unintentionally served a salad containing leaves of the Datura plant. That total is close to the number of people attending some of the Kirtland Temple dedicatory sessions, of which we will speak in just a moment. Of the 293, 5 died. 62% had confusion, 38% reported dizziness, 22% experienced diarrhea, 18% had nausea and vomiting, 12% experienced convulsions, and 8% reported hallucinations. This was an overdose event, but hallucinations were still a minor component.
What we're going to be doing today is reading a trip report online, commenting on what they did right, what they did wrong. This is all being done for safety and harm reduction. Of course, we don't suggest anyone does this, but if you are, we want to teach you how to do things safely. And if you ask me how to do things safely, is there's some compounds, plants that you should just not touch. One of them being Datura, Jimson weed, the devil's lettuce. So anyway, let's get into reading this story. All right, dose, 70 seeds. That already sounds like a little too much. First of all, I would like to let you all know that this is not a party drug. This is a very powerful, very poisonous plant. It is nothing at all like acid, and yes, it can kill you in a variety of ways. I had almost total amnesia after this experience.
Datura induces amnesia, and when hallucinations are remembered, the recollections usually occur gradually and piecemeal over weeks or months after the exposure. The Encyclopedia of Psychoactive Plants points out that the effects of Datura stramonium are dryness of the mouth, difficulty in swallowing, dilation of the pupils, restlessness, confusion, and hallucinations. The effects sometimes begin after only a half an hour, but may occasionally appear after 4 hours, and they can persist for days. Observers should think the individual was intoxicated, high, or inebriated for lengthy periods after the effects began. The encyclopedia also relates this unfortunate account that illustrates the unpredictable outcomes that may occur by consuming this plant. In the Canary Islands, Datura stramonium grows like a weed. Many young tourists have consumed teas made from the flowers, swallowed or smoked the seeds, or eaten the fresh leaves. The majority of the experiences they have reported have been unpleasant. One man who drank a tea made of the flowers collected and ate his feces for 3 days. Experiences like these may not predominate, but overall, this proposed entheogen does not reliably produce hallucinations that resemble the visions of early Latter-day Saints. The third entheogen on the chart, Hyoscyamus niger, or black henbane, is also a deliriant rather than a hallucinogen. This means it is more likely to cause delirium or prolonged state of confusion than deliver hallucinations. Depending upon the dose, this article, titled Black Henbane and Its Toxicity, a Descriptive Review, notes that it produces many additional outcomes besides hallucinations: mydriasis, or dilation of the eyes, tachycardia, or rapid heart rate, arrhythmia, agitation, convulsion, and coma, dry mouth, thirst, slurred speech, difficulty speaking, dysphagia, or difficulty swallowing, warm, flushed skin, pyrexia or fever, nausea, vomiting, headache, blurred vision, and photophobia, urinary retention, distension of the bladder, drowsiness, hyperreflexia, auditory, visual, or tactile hallucinations, confusion, disorientation, delirium, aggressiveness, and combative behavior. The Encyclopedia of Psychoactive Plants also explains the chopped, dried herbage of Hyoscyamus niger can be used as an ingredient in incense and smoking blends for brewing beer to spice wine and as a tea. Dosages must be assessed carefully no matter what type of preparation is being considered. As can be seen from these descriptions, the effects of this chemical are highly distinct from the visions of the early Latter-day Saints. It can produce a form of hallucinations, but not without intense and possibly fatal side effects. Amanita muscaria is an iconic mushroom, known to anyone who has played the video game Mario Kart. Amanita muscaria mushrooms are large and hard to miss, often described as remarkable and beautiful due to their scarlet red caps. They are considered a deliriant rather than a psychedelic because they don't act on the same receptors as psilocybin or psilocin. Instead, they act primarily on receptors that can cause an ethereal, dreamlike, and sedative state. Ingestion of Amanita muscaria in various forms leads to a state resembling alcoholic intoxication. At high doses, it may cause hallucinations, but its side effects also become more prominent. In his book, Shroom, A Cultural History of the Magic Mushroom, Andy Letcher describes a user of high-dose Amanita muscaria who found himself ascending through ever-increasing levels of bliss, each more magnificent than the last, until he achieved union with the clear white light, the source, the Godhead. This sounds a lot like a religious experience, but not like most of those reported by early church members. Letcher continues. Understandably excited, he attempted to repeat this experiment a few days later, but this time the experience was hellish. Losing all sense of time, space, and identity, he struggled to remember who he was. Coming to and remembering his name at last, he saw grotesque rope-like columns stretching upward to the sky, which turned out to be threads on a handkerchief upon which he was slumped and promptly vomited. The whole cycle, loss of identity, coming to and being sick, was repeated again and again for what seemed like an eternity until the effects eventually wore off. This account describes how the same mushroom could cause a type of spiritual hallucination one time and a disturbing non-religious hallucination during the second exposure. Responses are variable and impossible for observers, including users, to predict. A very common side effect of Amanita muscaria involves the GI system, causing nausea and vomiting. Due to its active ingredients, muscimol and ibotenic acid, while hallucinations can occur at higher doses, the higher doses can also increase the intensity of annoying side effects. It could be argued that Joseph Smith or any charlatan preacher would not choose the first 4 entheogens on the chart to produce religious visions because such hallucinations do not reliably occur with these substances and are consistently associated with bothersome side effects that, with respect to Datura and Hyoscyamus, can be fatal. This is a very important point. Secretly group doping, that is, administering any of these compounds to a large group, would result in erratic dosing for each individual, producing highly varied responses, few, if any, of which would resemble descriptions of early Latter-day Saint visions. Bad trips and even death would be genuine possibilities because dosages would be so uncontrolled. The next entheogen is from the Ancylus alvarius or Bufo alvarius species of Sonoran desert toad. Its parotid glands are filled with 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, or 5-MeO-DMT for short, which is a powerful hallucinogen and serves as a poison to the toad's predators. The primary problem alleging Joseph Smith may have used this is that no one appears to have known about its psychedelic effects in his day. This is a video about a young man in 1980.
Ken Nelson landed on an obscure paper which outlines the fact that this one toad species produces 5-MeO-DMT. And Ken had a light bulb go off. He found a Sonoran Desert toad, and he squeezed the gland onto his windshield, and when it dried, he scraped it off and he smoked it. And he had a transcendental experience.
The earliest I've traced a knowledge of the psychedelic qualities of smoking the parotid gland secretions of the Sonoran Desert toad is 1893. For several reasons, this entheogen should not have been included in a discussion about Joseph Smith. These observations suggest that realistically, the first 5 entheogens on the chart, which are discussed in the article, should not have been included because the first 4 do not reliably produce hallucinations similar to the early religious visions, and the 5th was unknown in Joseph Smith's time. The next entheogen is Lophophora williamsi, or the peyote cactus. It contains mescaline, which is not as strong as other psychedelics, so users must eat several individual cacti called peyote buttons to get an effect. Nausea, especially among first-time users, is very common, with sometimes multiple bouts of vomiting. Another problem is that it only grows 1,000 miles from the saints' primary settlements. The article declares Joseph Smith sent Lyman White to Texas to establish Mormon colonies. Joseph Smith may have attempted to plant a Mormon Indian colony in the heart of peyote country. I asked Mel Johnson, the author of the History of White's Texas Group, what he thought about claims that White was involved with peyote. He wrote, "As far as Lyman White and his Confederates, not a breath of implication exists for any such connection of that group of far travelers and any connection to psychedelics. Peyote can cause bad trips too. One case of a prolonged peyote-induced psychosis involved a 54-year-old Native American man with no prior history of psychosis. He drank peyote juice during a healing ceremony and within a few hours became convinced that he was hunted by animal spirits. He was unable to sleep for 2 weeks, at which time he developed visual and auditory hallucinations of the spirits and became increasingly depressed. Another problem is that spiking wine or bread with enough peyote cactus extract to give an effect to a large group of consumers would require a huge number of peyote buttons, which would require hours of gathering and preparation. It has a distinct taste, often referred to as bitter. Its taste and needed quantities to consume to achieve hallucinations would likely have been noticed. The duration of effects extends to 8 or 9 hours, with the users appearing inebriated during this time. Multiple pharmacological and logistical problems diminish peyote as a likely entheogen for Joseph Smith. The final entheogen discussed in the article involves the genus psilocybe mushrooms. These contain psilocybin, which is converted to psilocin in the intestines and affects serotonin receptors in the brain to create vivid hallucinations. Called magic mushrooms, a Life magazine reporter went to Mexico in 1957, ate 12 mushrooms under the supervision of a local shaman, and described his experience in his article. The following year, Gaston Guzman repeated that experiment. After consuming the mushrooms, he suddenly saw a caricature of a gigantic colored castle with 2 human faces. The castle was his gasoline lamp mushroom dryer at the opposite corner of the room. The castle smiled and said to him, come to me, don't be afraid." The author was greatly surprised and frightened, and he reached for his eyeglasses to see the mushroom dryer. Then the castle laughed loudly. He began to see many attractive, bright colors wherever he turned, regardless of whether his eyes were open or closed. These colors gradually transformed into gigantic black men who danced around him singing. In that moment, the author felt very comfortable and asked the castle to please keep silent because he was busy and happy looking at the spectacle. These gigantic men were really a little dog chasing a cat. After the above visions, he saw many others, spectacularly colored things and persons. But the castle was there all night saying to him, "Come, come to me." Another user, Mike Young, described, "I was in the middle of a technicolor sea, and there were bars of color, and I was floating through them, and they were floating through me. It was just glorious." Andy Letcher wrote, "One magic mushroom user told me how she was once overcome with gales of laughter when the moles and freckles on her arm got up and danced away. Intoxicated people behave strangely and ridiculously. The be-mushroomed might leap about, blather uncontrollably, or even stand stock still, pretending to be, well, a mushroom." Thousands of similar reports can be found in scientific and non-scientific literature. Multiple websites allow users to upload their own experiences. Some of these may resemble Latter-day Saint visions, but most do not. This study, Prediction of Psilocybin Responses in Healthy Volunteers, reports outcomes from psilocybin ingestion and notes responses to classical hallucinogens such as psilocybin strongly vary between and within subjects, even when the drug dose is kept constant. This is true for all entheogens. In other words, there is no such thing as a completely predictable or on-demand response to psychoactive chemicals. The volunteers reported the most common outcomes, including spiritual experiences, but also dread of ego dissolution, impaired control of cognition, and anxiety. Most of the reported outcomes were positive or neutral, like altered state of consciousness, oceanic boundlessness, visionary restructuralization, experience of unity, blissful state, insightfulness, disembodiment, complex imagery, elementary imagery, audio, visual synesthesia, and changed meaning of perception. Another study, Day Trip to Hell, a mixed method study of challenging psychedelic experiences, asked users of magic mushrooms to report on their typical and worst trips or drug experiences, summarizing their findings in a table. For this group, prominent feelings of their typical psychedelic experience included confusion, contact with non-ordinary beings, contact with transcendent forces, and ego death or dissolution. Feelings of homecoming or return to your essence, improved connection with nature, improved connection with other people, inner visions, insight into the world, insight into your relations, insight into yourself, joy, love, peace, surprise, and unity with transcendent forces. Themes of improved connection to nature and people, with insights into the world relations and self, along with joy, love, peace, all sound like religious themes and feelings. Another article verifies psychedelic compounds may generate reactions that recipients consider religious. Most participants reported vivid memories of the encounter experience, which frequently involved communication with something having the attributes of being conscious, benevolent, intelligent, sacred, eternal, and all-knowing. Still, another study reports increases in non-physicalist beliefs included belief in reincarnation, communication with the dead, existence of consciousness after death, telepathy, and consciousness of inanimate natural objects, such as rocks. The percentage of participants who identified as a believer in ultimate reality, higher power, and or God increased from 29% before to 59% after. This data suggests that if placed in a neutral setting, some psychedelic users will report religious experience. However, additional controlled experiments show that if users of hallucinogens are placed in a religious setting and preconditioned to expect a religious experience, more users will report a religious experience from the entheogen ingestion. Many of the characteristic feelings of hallucinogenic experiences parallel some religious feelings, which may explain why some observers, including advocates of the entheogen theory and the authors of the article, so easily conflate the effects of the psychedelics with the reports of visionary experiences from early Latter-day Saints. However, as some say, the devil or the disconnect is in the details. That is, generalities may seem to support the hypothesis, but specific details demonstrate the fallaciousness of the reasoning. This is apparent in reports from members at the Kirtland Temple dedication, like Oliver Cowdery, who wrote, "The glorious scene is too great to be described in this book. Therefore, I only say that the heavens were open to many, and great and marvelous things were shown. Near the close of the meeting, 2:00 in the morning, almost all present broke out in tongues and songs of Zion. Many saw visions, many prophesied, and many spoke in tongues. The Spirit was poured out. I saw the glory of God like a great cloud come down and rest upon the house and fill the same like a mighty rushing wind. I also saw cloven tongues, like as of fire, rest upon many, for there were 316 present. While they spake with other tongues and prophesied, President Frederick G. Williams bore record that a holy angel of God came and sat between him and Joseph Smith Sr. while the house was being dedicated." Another eyewitness, Benjamin Brown, recorded, "Brethren began to prophesy. Many prophesied in the name of the Lord, then began speaking in tongues, and it filled as it were the whole house. Perhaps there were 40 speaking at once. Cloven tongues of fire was seen to sit on many of them, and hand was seen laid upon one when he spake in tongues to the Lamanites. Many visions seen. One saw a pillar or cloud rest upon the house bright as when the sun shines on a cloud like as gold. 2 others saw 3 personages hovering in the room with bright keys in their hand and also a bright chain in their hands." Similarities and important differences are obvious between psychedelic trips and these visionary experiences. Temple dedication participants made no claims of disembodiment, oceanic boundlessness, intense bright colors, or ego death. None mentioned an enhanced connection with nature, increased introspective insights, or a oneness with the divine intelligence of the universe. Latter-day Saint visionaries spoke to a common restoration theme, even describing group visions. Group administration of psychedelic drugs produces, in contrast, only individualized responses. An important element missing from the temple accounts is evidence of bad trips. No Kirtland Temple attendees reported nausea or vomiting, excessive fear, agitation, panic, or feelings of losing sanity. Self-reported outcomes from users of psychedelic entheogens show that bad trips can happen even when you follow the rules of common sense. One study noted that 10.7% of users reported that under psilocybin, they placed themselves or others at risk of physical damage. Another study reported about 25.4% of the subjects reported long-term side effects, defined as symptoms or adverse reactions sustained for weeks or months. These included anxiety, depression, and dissociative symptoms. The American Psychiatric Association even has a diagnosis of hallucinogen persisting perception disorder that occurs in up to 4.2% of individuals who use hallucinogens. It involves the random re-experiencing of perceptual perturbations that the patient first encountered after ingesting a hallucinogen. These types of symptoms and reports are absent from available accounts describing early Latter-day Saint visionary experiences. This does not mean they did not occur, but believers and skeptical unbelievers could not have easily missed their stark and sometimes prolonged effects if pharmacology was responsible for their reported visions. A second notable contrast involves the lack of reports of non-religious psychedelic experiences as described by thousands of drug users in scientific and non-scientific reports. Imagine dozens of Kirtland members being dosed with an entheogen in spiked sacrament. What experiences would scientific studies predict they would report? While a few general similarities to psychedelic hallucinations may be identified, most of the specific descriptions in Latter-day Saint visionary accounts revolve around themes of the gospel restoration and differ in quality, duration, onset, and message from the generally non-religious but very vivid feelings and experiences related by hallucinogen users. For example, Latter-day Saints related no reports of non-religious trips where inanimate objects talk, bright colors float, animals transform into people. Neither did they relate great connections to nature, introspective insights, or oneness with the ultimate reality or God. They spoke of experiencing the divine, but in remarkably different ways with different outcomes. Perhaps the greatest problem with the entheogen theory is its overall lack of specificity when explaining how a deceiving religious leader might have been able to pull off a large group doping by spiking wine and bread, where small quantities of either are sufficient to create vivid hallucinations that the followers would mistake for God-inspired visions. The logistics of supplying dozens or hundreds of worshipers with any form of psychedelic and doing it secretly without their awareness seems mind-boggling. Magic mushrooms resemble many other poisonous mushrooms. Gaining the expertise needed to avoid the death caps would have taken significant training. One professional mushroom forager spent the day with his wife collecting mushrooms for their evening meal. As they sautéed their fungal feast, they noticed a death cap mushroom cooking in the mix. He recalled, "The smell was so tantalizing, we wanted to eat it desperately. After all, you can eat anything once." In the case of psilocybin mushrooms, if a dose of 5 mushrooms per person was sufficient, 1,500 would be needed for a group of 300 people. 5 may not be sufficient, so spiking the sacrament of groups of visionaries in the Kirtland Temple sessions could have required many thousands. If administered secretly, hundreds of mushrooms would need to be pulverized into powder using a mortar and pestle. Such processing would be time-consuming and require a clean space wherein to operate. Depending on the storage methods, magic mushrooms can lose a third of their potency in just 1 week. The reality is that the amount of behind-the-scenes work required to make any entheogen available to a congregation would be so substantial that someone would have likely noticed the shenanigans. George Orwell observed, "Each generation imagines itself to be more intelligent than the one that went before it and wiser than the one that comes after it. This is an illusion." The vast majority of early church members were not gullible dupes. They would have wondered at a sacrament composed of strange-tasting water or wine, or the need to munch not on just a small piece of bread, but several biscuits that tasted like mushrooms or cactus. Equally, some observers probably would have noticed a cause and effect relationship to feelings of intoxication that resulted consistently after the sacrament. The duration of the supposed visionary effects, from many hours to days, depending upon the chemical substance and the user's physiology, might have also raised suspicions. In reality, the entheogen theory portrays the authors of the article as more perceptive than eyewitness victims of the alleged spiked sacraments. But as Orwell observed, it is an illusion. Most of the early followers were just as skeptical as you and me today. We recall Martin Harris switched Joseph Smith's seerstone in the hat to test his translating ability. Critical biographer Fawn Brody also wrote, "The best evidence of the magnetism of the Mormon religion was that it could attract men with the quality of Brigham Young, whose tremendous energy and shrewd intelligence were not easily directed by any influence outside himself." Advocates of the entheogens theory may claim that the practice of ingesting and spiking the sacrament was so secret that it was and remains undetectable. It is true that several secret practices existed in Joseph Smith's day. Polygamy, the temple ceremony, the Council of 50, and Freemason ceremonies were all secret. However, multiple books and articles have been written about all of these then secret practices, which are now openly acknowledged. Are we to believe a fifth secret practice of Joseph Smith's also existed? One so widespread that it was responsible for the visionary experiences he and others reported, but unlike the other four practices that are now widely known, no direct historical traces have been found. The Joseph Smith Papers Project has published 28 volumes dealing with Joseph Smith's personal writings, and nothing directly supports a special interest or expertise in entheogenic substances. In 1834, Eber D. Howe published statements from 22 local residents and 2 group statements from the inhabitants of Palmyra and Manchester. In 1842, John C. Bennett published a laundry list of complaints against Joseph Smith and the church members. 2 years later, William Law printed his own collection of accusations against Joseph Smith. In 1880, newspaperman Frederick G. Mather compiled written collections from 12 citizens of Susquehanna, Broome, and Chenango counties, Pennsylvania. 8 years later, Arthur Deming printed accounts from 14 individuals who knew the Smiths in their early days, publishing 2 volumes of Naked Truths about Mormonism. None of these 50 acquaintances of the Smiths related or accused Joseph of learning about, seeking, preparing, storing, supplying, ingesting, or possessing expertise with specific herbs or substances that would be called entheogens. The Entheogens article also claims that visionary experiences of the magnitude experienced during Joseph Smith's life ceased at his death. This is unsupported by available research. Reported visionary experiences peaked in 1836, correlating to the dedication of the Kirtland Temple. Joseph Smith's revelation had for years promised an endowment of power to be given to church members at that dedication, but not specifically at any other time. Further research demonstrates that reports of visionary and supernatural experiences continued at a steady rate in the years after the Kirtland Temple dedication and after Joseph Smith's death, just as they continue today. In 2020, after noticing over 20 references in the article to Michael Quinn's research, particularly on the magic worldview, I sent a copy to him and asked his opinion. He responded, I have never, in caps, I have never written nor spoken, even privately, in favor of their speculation. You may quote me. In summary, the entheogen theory claims that entheogens may have caused early Latter-day Saint visions. However, when specific drug effects and logistics are identified and contextualized to the specific details of the spiritual experiences, the hypothesis is shown to be erroneous. This presentation demonstrates 3 important points. First, no chemical substance consistently produces only positive hallucinations consistent with early Latter-day Saint visionary reports. All produce some bad trips, but most psychotropic effects are considered non-religious by drug users. Second, Joseph Smith would have encountered essentially insurmountable obstacles trying to acquire and surreptitiously administer hallucinogens to skeptical church members without them figuring out what was going on. Third, no direct historical evidence exists describing Joseph Smith at any time during his life, learning about, seeking, preparing, storing, supplying, ingesting, or possessing expertise with specific herbs or any substances that might be called entheogens. Thank you.